Hi, everyone. My name is Martin Weinstein. I'm one of the chairs here at the Hyperledger Climate Action Special Interest Group. And one of the things that has been happening since we launched at the beginning of the year is that we've been gathering different areas of the community to put working group efforts around. To present very quickly today is on the standards and protocols working group. There's been 3 working groups. One's on consumer disclosure, one on carbon neutrality certifications, and standards, as I'll describe, I think is one of the things that underlines the other working groups as well. Some of the key active members are Christian Pao from Nova Institute, Tom Bauman, my other co-chair. Unfortunately, both have not been able to join, so I'll be also representing their coordination efforts on their behalf. One of the things that is quite relevant when we think about climate accounting and the relevance of climate action accounting is that standards is really what allows us to ensure that things are speaking the same language. When someone measures an action on the ground, when we are using IoT devices, when we're working on a company level or an individual level, whether it's a carbon footprint, whether it's certifying a renewable energy project, how that fits within a national level inventory, a country effort, it's really the common language that allows this accounting to integrate towards ultimately the ultimate accounting realm, which is planet Earth. In the case of the climate challenge, everything needs to be able to, in some sense, aggregate and scale up and roll up to that global level and speak ideally directly to the Paris Agreement. So standards is really what allows us to ensure that all the different efforts and the business efforts, because since the last 3 or 4 years, there's been an amazing amount of companies producing different tokens for carbon certifications, tokens for carbon offsets, but we're moving into a future of an interconnected climate markets where we need to make sure that we can speak at least common languages. And this actually reminds us a lot of how the internet evolved and the role that protocols have to allow for that interoperability to happen. If we think about emails, we have the Smart Mail Transfer Protocol. If we think about websites, we have the hyperspace, the hypertext transaction protocol. And this is the type of things that we're also looking in the evolution of the climate world as we have to coordinate our efforts as a global community in sync. So that's in some sense the general context of why standards and protocols are so relevant for the climate space. And I'll give a slight context of why they're specifically interesting for our special interest group. So we have 2 other videos that were presented by our working group leaders, one on consumer disclosure and one on carbon neutrality. And I'll share my screen just to give you a sense of what's the framework for how standards fit also within those working groups. The generic role of any form of certificate of quality that can obviously be tokenized is the outcome of a process of reviewing, right, or a review process. And what the standard allows is that we use the same type of logics on how we review a certain process, and we use the same type of standards for a certificate of quality for that. And it also links to the digital verification and the records that are assigned to those standards. Now, we can think generically of how this applies to our couple of working groups. So if we think about carbon neutrality, what its efforts are about are the carbon neutral calculations for, let's say, data servers is a good example. Out of that comes a carbon neutral certificate, a claim that speaks to whether basically data hosting is carbon neutral or not. So we really need to have those standards, technology, accounting, offset standards, and the digital verification of records that take the form of software. We could do the same thing from the point of view of consumer disclosure. What we're looking at in consumer disclosure, what the work we've been focusing on is supply chain tracking and accounting with a certificate of quality that says, this is the rating of the product, this is how much carbon was emitted by the production and the consumption of that product. So back again, this is where standards fit and the role that software can help in simplifying and easing the role of those standards applied to those different use cases. Now, this is also a fractal logic because different parts of a review, when we're reviewing a process, can have their own internal process review. Supply chains are extremely complex. Climate accounting is extremely interconnected. So if we're able to come up and explore the ways in which distributed ledger technologies help create a chain of trust around the standards and the verification process, then we can able to produce tools that better cater to different use cases that address specifically the certificates of quality and obviously the tokenization field. So for example, this, what I'm showing here is part of a Google slide that we put together within the special interest group wiki. So anyone that's interested on the standards working group, this is definitely the place to go. And there's a lot of content that we've been able to put together and a lot of work around climate mapping some of these standards and certificates. So a couple of last comments that I want to make is what distinguishes the approach that we've decided to take. And obviously there's a couple of series of types of standards that we have to look at. On one side, technical standards like W3C has a big part in terms of you know, the type of protocols, networking language that are used. There's obviously a lot of accounting standards. Greenhouse gas protocols are quite relevant, but also environmental performance standards and standards related to products. So on one side, we have to look at the types of standards. On the other side, the type of families that are specifically relevant to the climate world. So when it comes to climate, in our discussion so far, the working group, we could really break it down to some four pieces of families. One is measuring, collecting data that relates to activities, climate action activities. What are the methodologies that are associated to that? That's probably the second family. And on one side, there's methodologies for acquiring data, and then there's methodologies and standards for processing that data in terms of transforming that raw data into values that we can actually assign to either a climate action or a product. The third family relates more to the reporting standards. It's like now we have the data, we've processed the data, we're going to report around that, which is very specific to the claims. What are the standards that we use there? And then the fourth one is the quality standards, the verification of all those previous steps. So it's really quite a broad field. Now, what is our role within that? Is not to develop standards. There's a lot of standards bodies. There's a lot of alliances that have been forming around the climate space that really we can leverage from. So really our role is to help by mapping the field. That's one of the things we noticed there was a gap, that we could come up with a working group to help fill the gap. Classify, you know, in some ways evaluate different taxonomies that can be used for standards, and explore how software can be leveraged to digitize processes in the standardization process. And fundamentally collaborate with anyone else working on the standard space in the climate world, where our efforts can be compatible. What are the type of work and collaborations that we're looking at from the working group? Well, if you're a standards expert, irrespective of the climate space, then your input as a subject domain expert is very much welcome on how we tackle this. If you're a climate MRV expert, monitoring, reporting, and verifying actions, then your role is also very critical, because a lot of the climate standards are historically analog. They haven't been digitized. And so the big role about standardization is how do we make this digitally compatible? Finally, if you are spearheading or part of an initiative that's actively working on standards around climate tokens, then our work with you is specifically relevant.